By 1698, the Reformation of Manners movement that emerged in the years following the Glorious Revolution was, in certain respects, at its height. It was in that year that the movement loosed itself from the confines of London and proliferated throughout the British Isles. And at the same moment, high-profile cases initiated by reformers targeting specific forms of transgressive behaviour, such as sodomy, reached new levels of public consciousness. The spread of the movement was driven by a febrile sense of necessity. If the revolution of 1688-9 and the hard-won toleration that followed represented providential sanction for the Protestant cause, then a decade on, it was time to finally secure that divine delivery. As one Reformation sermon preacher put it, quote, "When shall it be, if not such a day as this?" The relative impact of the reforming campaigns on public life was governed by prevailing narratives and counter-narratives. Each iteration of the movement responded to the particular concerns of the communities from which they emerged. Despite extensive scholarship on the subject, accounts of the Societies for the Reformation of Manners remain stubbornly London-centric. This is at least in part consequence of the available evidence and the longevity of the movement in the capital into the mid-18th century. Today, however, I hope, we'll draw attention to newly identified sources and pursue hitherto unexplored lines of inquiry to bring fresh perspectives to the movement in local, national, and international contexts. Now, briefly on format, Hanna will next introduce her case study she's been working on, then I'll introduce mine. We'll get into those in a little bit more detail, then hopefully we'll find some points of discussion between the two. So, Hanna, please.
Okay, my source and my case study I will present here today. It's rather not a newly identified case, but newly identified perspective, I think. And I'm going to tell you about Captain Rigby's case. Let's meet this guy. This case is quite famous among queer scholars, queer studies scholars, and it was mentioned in a lot of books and already partly published. You can easily Google it and so on. But I made it a part of my current research, and hopefully upcoming book, I will publish it hopefully during the next months. This book is dedicated to the same-sex relations at the court of Peter the Great. And first, when I just started to write this book, I thought that this book is going to be dedicated to same-sex relations themselves. But then I realized that this approach is not very good. And when I finalized my manuscript, I realized that it is a totally different thing. And I realized that we can never know about sexual or personal relations in a distant eras, especially about some famous and very legendary persons. Instead of that, I'm suggesting another approach, that we should talk about not about relations themselves, but about what contemporaries thought about these relations and how they reflected it in a wide range of sources. So Captain Rigby's case, and I will tell more in details later, it's part of this research. So this is one of the earliest cases mentioned Peter's homosexual activities. Of course, it's one of the most important sources because it's extremely detailed, and it's it's a kind of when you're reading these documents, you can imagine it in pictures, so it's very picturesque and so on. So and of course, regarding our main topic, it's one of the earliest and most important cases regarding the earliest stage of activities of these societies in London. So it's very London-centric. Yeah, but not only London-centric, as we will tell you.
That's great. So yeah, my contribution today draws from my recent study on the Society for the Reformation of Manners in Hull, which was published as a monograph by the University of Wales Press in 2023. And it presents an unparalleled and previously unexplored record of a provincial reforming society at the turn of the 18th century. That society was formed on the 18th of February 1698 by 45 religiously motivated mariners, merchants, and tradesmen in the town who hoped to combat, quote, the abounding sin and wickedness of the present age, the public drunkenness, swearing, Sabbath breaking, and prostitution that they daily encountered in their town. Now, the principal methods pursued by the society will be largely familiar. They initiated prosecutions against their neighbours' transgressions and sponsored sermons on the subject of moral reformation. But unlike other societies that we already know about and that were formed elsewhere, most of the whole reformers were dissenters from the Church of England, which inevitably raised divisive questions about who had authority to direct voluntary religious enterprises in the years after 1688. The question that it brought to my mind is, in post-revolutionary England then, just how far could the toleration be tolerated? The records of the whole society provide rare insights into the formation, the activities, and the eventual decline of a provincial reforming society. And it includes the only complete list of prosecutions for any society outside of London. So in that way, it offers an almost unique lens on the wider Reformation of Manners movement at the turn of the 18th century.
And now let's head back to Capt. Rigby. At the very end of 1698, he was accused of being sodomite, terrible, terrible sodomite. I think the way he came to is very interesting. So this case, and I want to say briefly that despite it was published many times and in the internet and different books, it was never published as a full manuscript. So there are few versions of this trial. The first and the most popular, it's a pamphlet edited and published in the same year, and like depicted this case as a terrible case of sodomy, and it's a kind of foreign influence, and sodomites are coming for our children, and so on and so on. But another version is now it's in London Metropolitan Archives. I was working with this original thing, and it's much more detailed and more interesting, I think, because it's some extra pages, extra parts, which were never published in print. Because we were talking why, like, and it could be like instruction for another people who tried to hook up this some guys in St. James Park. So Captain Rigby tried to hook up some beautiful young men in St. James Park during the Guy Fawkes night. And he succeeded, and he had this conversation and special handshaking and some. So they had this secret ritual to how to recognize another man interested in this kind of conversations, I would say. And St. James Park was a very popular place for a gay cruising during that time, and that's why he found himself there talking to a beautiful young man, William Minton. And they, of course, Minton said that he's agreed to extend their meeting in a special place in the George Tavern and Pall Mall, so in the same area. But later he turned out to be agent provocateur of societies, and Rigby was catched on this criminal scene, having with Minton. And the interesting for me, it's their conversation. Minton said later in Old Bailey court, accusing Rigby of being sexually assaulted by him, that Rigby tried to convince him to have sex using different examples and some kind of rhetoric features that that being sodomite, it's a normal thing. It was this rhetorical feature, like referring to some great historical features like Alexander the Great or some other guys from antiquity. It was quite popular in English rhetorics of this time. For example, Edward II by Christopher Marlowe contains the same. But Rigby was especially creative, and he used contemporary examples. And among that examples was Peter the Great and his favorite Alexander Lynch. So this is the most important thing for me. And since this case was used mainly in queer studies and so on, I think this there are more important even sometimes and more interesting context and wider context. So I pose this international and intercultural context because Rigby was a Navy officer and he went different places and especially Mediterranean region during his career. So it made him, it could make him a bit alien in British society due to this like othering traditions. For example, this understandings of Southern cultures as cultures with a propensity of sodomy and different aggressive sexual practices. Another perspective is, of course, a Russian perspective. And my question is, was it the true story? Because Rigby not only mentioned Peter, he described that he had his own experience peeping through the hole in the sea, as he said, for Peter having sex with his boyfriend. And I have to say that it's not true. I checked Peter's personal court journals. So his life is very good documented. So sometimes you can even trace every day of his life. And I, with the help of my colleague Ben Nilsson, who suggested this idea, I overlapped it with Captain Rigby, Captain lot. And I realized that he never met Peter personally, and the only they could meet. It was like Rigby noticed that he observed Tsar's yacht, the river Midway, somewhere near Rochester. So I'm not sure if he had such a good eyesight to observe Peter's sexual contact with his favorite. So I think from this point of view, it's interesting about to talk about some wandering plots, because Rigby could catch this plot from somewhere. It could be some other his colleague's story, or maybe made up story, because Peter visited London a few months before, and he was kind of celebrity. So here we can talk also about some kind of celebrity culture and why Rigby preferred to use this example to seduce this young man. And of course, it's seems to be, for the first sight, it seems to be a very London-centric and British-centric story. But if we will try to use another perspectives, it has a wide international context. So this is my point, that I want to continue my research of this case in these directions, and of course I will be happy to discuss this, like opportunities and possibilities to work with this source.
Okay, thanks for that. So I suppose when thinking about my case, in contrast to Hanna's work, I think the experience of the society in whole stands in stark contrast in many respects, especially in terms of narrative and public perception and sort of public reach of the campaign. And a thread that can be traced throughout the records is the society in whole struggles to effectively embed their campaign into the cultural life of the town. So one contributing factor to this is the society's lack of external support. In their founding orders, which I mentioned was in February 1698, they cited the influence of other reformers elsewhere in London and in Nottingham in how they shaped their nascent campaign, suggesting that, you know, the would-be reformers in Hull were conversant with the published literature on the reforming movement, with Woodward's account. But otherwise, aside from that, they appear to have gone it alone in many respects. Whereas, you know, to use a contrasting example, if you look to the society that's formed in Dublin, or societies formed in Dublin, these reformers were in direct communication with their London counterparts, and they actually developed, say, a system of transmission of blank warrants over to Ireland. This was to facilitate summary prosecutions and pecuniary fines for transgressors. But in the case of the society in whole, there's no evidence of this ongoing communication with reformers anywhere else. This was an enclosed, a self-contained movement. And as such, I'll just add, yes, that meant that it became particularized to its locality, and that particularization was particularly characterized by the dissenter, the fact it was dissenter-led and majority dissenter membership, which stands apart, I think, from any other society that we're already aware of. So another significant blockage to the development of the campaign was the obstructiveness of the Anglican hierarchy. Despite this denominationally mixed character of the society, from the outset, its members, they really wanted the legitimizing support of church leaders. And as such, their first formal decision was to seek Archbishop John Sharp's countenance and encouragement for what they called their great undertaking. You know, there are many reasons for this, you know, aside from just pure legitimization. You know, only in practical terms, only the bishop could direct the local clergy, for example, to tackle the subject of moral reformation in their regular preaching courses. But in making their approach to the archbishop, they seem to have fatally mistaken his attitude towards these societies. The archbishop held typically high church reservations about the legality of these mixed groups pursuing ostensibly religious goals, in terms that he saw as potentially contravening the conventicle acts, especially, as I said, when there was mixed membership involved. Sharp's eventual response to the society in Hull was equivocating. He wrote that he, quote, greatly approved of their design, but he was unable to order the town's clergy to preach before them because the societies were not, in his view, organized according to law. Now, while Sharp's response to the Hull society was deliberately vague, he expressed other opinions elsewhere, which suggested he was quite firmly against these societies. Writing to some reformers in Nottingham, he said, and I'll quote, "I can by no means allow any clergyman of my diocese to preach as a lecturer of this society, because it will be giving an encouragement to the breaking of those laws which I have myself bound in conscience to see observed." Now, this missive all but snuffed out any organized, I should say, reforming work in Nottingham, because without the Archbishop's support, you know, the society was hamstrung in embedding itself in the local culture, as I said. But the members in Hull pressed on regardless. And the impact of this refusal can be seen in the society's haphazard attempts to secure preachers to preach before them. You know, establishing Reformation sermons was often one of the very first acts undertaken by any new society. But because of Archbishop Sharp's refusal to help, it was over a year before any preacher agreed to preach before them at all. And in that case, it was on that occasion, it was Robert Banks, the vicar of Holy Trinity Church, and his was the first of only 6 Reformation sermons that were preached before the society between the years 1699 and 1703. Whereas by contrast, in Bristol, where the reformers had the support of their bishop, Bishop John Hall, Reformation sermons became part of the regular preaching courses, preached every week. This never occurred in Hull. It was left to individual clergymen, to their consciences, whether they were going to be supportive of the society's aims. Where the society had greater success, however, was in securing the sanction and the cooperation of the town's magistrates, the civil magistracy. Whereas reformers in London and elsewhere used a system of printed warrants to bring offenders to prosecution, often relying heavily on the cooperation of a few magistrates who were sympathetic to their aims, those in Hull appealed directly to the town's corporation for legal impetus to further their campaign. In the autumn of 1698, the society asked the mayor for a warrant to empower them to search for disorderly houses and persons, and he readily complied. And on the 7th of November of 1698, he issued directions in the following terms, and I'll quote, "To the end the laws may be put into due execution against all profaners of the Lord's day, for the more effectual restraint of that great offence, you are hereby required to take a strict account of all persons who do not on that day frequent or go to their parish church, or some other congregation or religious meeting permitted by law." The mayor's warrant followed the tenor of several statutes governing Sabbath breaking, with stipulations most pertinent to Hull's maritime community, including fines for persons travelling by vessels, by trading, or otherwise carrying on their ordinary calling on a Sunday. Also targeted were leisure activities such as games, sports, and drinking at times when people were supposed to be in church. This was followed by a second warrant on the 24th of November 1698, which spoke directly to the issue of disorderly behaviour. And I'll quote, "For as much as I am credibly informed that this town of Kingston upon Hull, and places adjacent are infested with rogues, whores, vagabonds, lewd, wicked, profane, and idle persons that live disorderly and are of evil lives and conversation, to the danger and quiet and peace of the civil and sober inhabitants thereof." Now, the society's positive relationship with the local magistracy allowed them to work within the town system of law enforcement. With no legal impediments to selection on religious grounds, constables were not required to take the oaths of allegiance or supremacy or required to provide a sacrament certificate, the only condition being that they were honest, able, and understanding men. And so, on the 30th of September 1698, society members were appointed to 5 of the 13 constables' places in the town. This put reformers on the streets at the forefront of the campaign and empowered them, in the name of the king, to summarily detain offenders or put them in the stocks. Now, so whereas I've sort of very briefly sketched this difficult relationship between the reformers and the ecclesiastical establishment, this functional relationship between reformers and the magistracy brought about early success. They secured between 70 and 95 prosecutions a year between 1698 and 1701. But the relative isolation and confessional complexion of the society meant it was highly susceptible to changing politico-religious circumstances. And I just want to conclude this section with some reflections to jump forward and reflect on their eventual decline from this position. Now, the death of William III on the 8th of March 1702 was a pivotal moment for the reforming movement, and especially for the dissenter-led society in Hull. Had the providential moment passed for those with shared hopes of Protestant unity and a national reformation of manners? Anne's accession quickly brought about a new complexion to church affairs, not least the promotion of Archbishop Sharp to the informal position of the Queen's ecclesiastical advisor. Though Anne had reiterated the royal decrees against immorality, her accession heralded a marked shift in relations between Anglicans and Dissenters. On the 18th of April 1702, Robert Banks, who I briefly mentioned earlier as being one of the first preachers before the society in Hull, he wrote to the Vicar of Leeds, writing that Archbishop Sharp had set out for London, and he added, quote, "I know not how the dissenters are amongst you, but here they appear much more humble than formerly, or rather more out of humour since Her Majesty ascended the throne, and they begin by way of prediction to talk of persecution, when I dare say no such thing is intended, if they can keep themselves quiet." Now, these concerns were far from groundless. Under Anne, occasional conformity, being concerns around the occasional attendance of dissenters at parish churches to qualify for public office, quickly became a national issue for the first time. Though an occasional conformity bill narrowly failed to get through Parliament in 1703, the struggles it unleashed laid bare simmering tensions between Anglicans and dissenters, and created an atmosphere that was increasingly unfavourable to a lay-led reforming movement. Dissenting rhetoric from this time on spoke more to toleration than comprehension, whereas hardline high churchmen were fixed on their total exclusion. What is clear is that from 1702, the society's activities entered into terminal decline. The numbers of prosecutions it initiated fell by 3/4 on the previous year, and they were all but inactive from 1703. So another significant factor, I think, in this decline of the provincial Reformation societies, which were relatively short-lived, were Anglican efforts to contain the reforming movement within the Church of England. From 1699, this inadvertently fell to the newly formed Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge, or SPCK. Through the creation of these exclusively Anglican clerical networks, the SPCK played an increasingly important role in promoting, steering, and regulating reforming work. Involvement with the SPCK presented a route for Anglican clergymen to convect away from mixed societies, leaving dissenters progressively isolated from religious projects. Unable to participate in Anglican educational schemes and other religious projects as mentioned, dissenting society members channel their energies and resources into other enterprises for social good. And you see them becoming in Hull, being increasingly active in the new Corporation of the Poor, which was established in 1698 as well. So in this environment, the Society of for the Reformation of Manners in Hull was effectively defunct by 1706. It shone brightly, but briefly. And I think I'll conclude my case there.
Now we are going to the practical part of our speech. And I think that one of the main questions of this case of Captain Rigby is why it's so important. And one of the ways of to answering this question was what happened to him. Because he wasn't punished very hard. He spent some time in under trial. Then he spent a few months in prison, in some prison, we don't know exactly where exactly. And then he paid some money, some penal money, and he was shown to the crowd, staying near the pillar in a different important places in London, but important detail that crowd wasn't allowed to touch him. So he was never beaten or like something, but he just was shown to the crowd. And of course it was a shameful and but without a big damage to him. And then he, in some way, he fled to France and converted to Catholic. He became Catholic. And this is a very, very interesting point. And so this detail shows us this wider context, because I suspect that Captain Rigby's case, it's not only the case about homosexuality or about wandering plots, but it's important because it shows this public imagination about different kinds of transgressive sexuality. But important thing that I think that it's some political background here, because talking to Minton there in the dark alleys of St. James Park, Rigby mentioned that he is living somewhere near Temple Bar with his relative, Alexander Rigby, a member of Parliament. He was present in Lancashire area, famous for its Jacobites movements and so on. And we can see that Captain turns to Catholicism, and I suspect that it's a good way and it's a good perspective to dig deeper in the future to this political background, because it was the first big sodomy trial in London. And it's interesting why sodomy, because in your case, sodomy doesn't play an important role, even in considering this transgressive sexual behavior. I would say that this case became very famous. There were another case in the very same time about another sodomites or club of sodomites. It's not precisely Molly House, we cannot say, because it's not enough documents and evidence. And the only thing I know about the second case is that some of them killed themselves. For example, one of guys who was suspected to be in this club, he cut his own throat wearing women's gown in his house. But it's the only evidence. But Rigby's case became extremely famous. And for example, Daniel Defoe wrote about it. And some other guys discussed it in their letters. And it was a subject of different pamphlets and reports and rumors and even books, because it was published a few times in this publications were after this, the first pamphlet, so it's a shortened version. But it was published again and again during the 18th century, for example, when persecution of homosexual and this homosexual subculture in London was became more and more intensive. So the question is why this case became so famous and why they used sodomy as a cause for this. And of course, another thing it's I said about othering part of this case, and for me it's important that we are talking about Navy captain, and his experience didn't include any sodomy scandals before, but he had a lot of scandals with his colleagues. And he was even under trial for losing another ships. So there are some points of tension around him, we can see. And he was like very, I think, guy who could make this steer because he was part of full of this homosexual tension society. It's like fleet, navy. It's a lot of men, sometimes sexually frustrated men in some place, is isolated from other part of society for a long time. Another point, the main directions of his like navy traveling was Turkey, Italy, and Spain. And there were a lot of stereotypes about, especially about Italy and Turkey, that these places when they have very strange sexual habits and wrong mores and propensity of sodomy, and it's possible to transmit these habits as a disease. So it's a very popular idea about homosexuality in early modernity. And another link to this other tradition, it's a Russian topic, because Russians were treated and by Western European culture in the same way. So there was a lot of anti-Russian pamphlets in that time described Russians as perverts with the wildest customs, as well as Turks, for example. Turks is embodiment of Muslims. So here we can see that this case gathered together a lot of interesting and like perspectives, and it's not only about sodomy, it's about wider policies, wider politics, and about, of course, the activities of societies of Reformation of Manners, and about personal story of this guy, because he was like a very interesting person, I suspect. And also it's about different international perspectives.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, something that's come out of the discussions of our two cases is I've been prompted to return to this prosecutions list that exists in the records of the society to see if there was any trace of a concern or a preoccupation with the crime of sodomy, or an interest in homosexual relations and other forms of transgressive sexual behaviour. It's worth pointing out, obviously, Hull is a maritime community. It's a garrison town as well. So these both play significant role in the complexion of that community. But looking again at the records, I could find no trace of any well, certainly not sodomy or any other preoccupation with transgressive sexual behavior, except for heterosexual, heteronormative prostitution. And even then, that was sort of coded or masked under this catch-all term of disorderly behavior. At no point did the Hull reformers say we are going to crack down on prostitution. Yeah. And so within the records, the society's usual method was to pursue relatively minor crimes, swearing, Sabbath breaking, gaming, to pursue summary prosecution and see the issuing of fines by local magistrates. That's quite a common sort of practice. It's only a brief period for about 3 to 6 months where there's these organized raids where they make use of that mayor's warrant and they send out maybe 3, 4, 5 society members as in concert together as informants to I presume catch people in the very act of a sexual congress or soliciting sex on the streets. And And you can only pick that up from the records because suddenly there'll be a series of men and women prosecuted together for disorderly behaviour. Sometimes on other individual occasions, women will be prosecuted for bawdry or being sexually disorderly, and you have to sort of piece together, what the records are telling. But just on the absence of any trace of preoccupation with sodomy, thinking why that might have been. Well, I wondered if it was too high profile a crime to fall under the auspices of the society. Quite clearly these organized raids I mentioned, that sort of organized activity drops off very quickly, I think, and they return to this pattern of small fines for relatively minor crimes. Again, this might be explained by an absence of a recognizable queer subculture or recognition of what that sort of behavior looked like on the streets, even in the available supporting literature of the movement, the sermons, the kind of religious treaties written on this. Sodomy doesn't really get a look in as a potential crime. It's really about the issue of prostitution and houses of bawdry being a polluting influence and sort of dens of wider criminality. So it was an issue that I hadn't encountered when I first looked at the records. Our discussions prompted me to go back to the records, and I still don't think there's anything there. And I think that's interesting in itself, because it suggests that this was a sort of metropolitan phenomenon, or a phenomenon that was beyond the reach of these smaller provincial campaigns.
Yeah, and I want to add that this difference is even more striking because in case of Capt. Rigby, they already had a proper vocabulary for a description of some certain sexual practices he suggested to his friend William Lincoln, or some names of sodomy, different, synonymous or something. So this is a sign that they already had some idea about. And of course, the introduction to this story when they met each other in St. James Park, and it says that they already had some subculture with its own secret language and some special signs, and because Rigby shaked Minton's hand in some special way, and then they made some exchange of special phrases and so on. So here we have opposite situations. And I want to give another example from Swedish practice, Swedish sodomy cases, and in some provincial areas, when they had this persecution, usually they hadn't proper language, and these people being accused, they couldn't explain what happened, and they tried to do that with some euphemisms, but not with a intention of being modest or something. They basically hadn't these words. So this is a good sign for an absence of a proper queer subculture or something. So yes, here and in case of London, we are talking about some metropolitan things and a big city with a gathering people from around the world, and it's a bigger opportunity to meet some people interested in the same things.
Yeah. Thanks, Hanna. I just wanted to make, after saying or speaking briefly about an absence of something in the records, I just wanted to speak more positively about what we can take from the prosecutions list. I think, a couple of assumptions or positions put forward even by contemporaries say that the reformers prosecuted, there was an accusation the reformers prosecuted their social inferiors. Well, one way of trying to assess that from the records we have for the society in Hull is that the fines issued for the various minor crimes were socially gradated. So, I can't remember the exact figures, but it was a lesser amount for a day labourer or a tradesman, and then more for an artisan, etc., etc. And the great majority of the fines issued are not in the lowest band. They sort of for the sort of middling, sort of skilled trades person. That's the sort of level we're talking about that these would be applicable to. So I didn't find any direct evidence that the reformers were particularly targeting their social inferiors. Another thing that I think was of interest was if we were to look at the notorious blacklists which were issued by the London reformers, which gave these great long laundry lists of names of persons prosecuted by these annual reports of people prosecuted by London societies. They're often crowded with the names of women, often poor women, which reflected the London society's preoccupation, certainly with cracking down on prostitution. I think one example I've seen for 1706, I think about 90% of the names on there are the names of women, this was criticised by Daniel Defoe and others at the time, who said that where are the names of some of these more prominent figures we know have fallen foul of the societies. But when I looked at the tabulated the figures for Hull, I think it was something like 1 in 8 or 1 in 9 of all of the crimes prosecuted involved women, actually. So certainly we can say that the blacklists presented an incredibly skewed picture of female criminality, which in the case of Hull, at least, certainly wasn't borne out, and in fact seemed to be the sort of opposite. The opposite case was true. Yeah.
Yeah, in the case of Captain Rigby, we can talk also about some wider metropolitan culture, because and also cultural connections, because for example, in one of pamphlets published about this case, Rigby was accused not only of being sodomite and pervert or something, he was accused also of being fashionable man and type of fop. And this is important link because in many cultures, in Russian culture, for example, it was also connected that being fashionable, beautiful, and like treat yourself in a good way,
yeah,
and being sodomite for a man. So this link between beauty and being handsome and being sodomite. And this sodomy case shows different connections, maybe not very obvious for a modern people, like for example, being fashionable, being sodomite, being some kind of metrosexual, something, being a traitor, being heretic, but in early modern time, in the different cultures, again, it was very interconnected, all these segments and parts, because it's reflected clearly some kind of disorder, some kind of behavior which violated divine order of the universe. So all these things were like treated like some kind of disorder. And here we have a opposite situation, because we are not talking about some fashionistas or some folks in this environment, because they're right.
Well, I think where this comes through, actually, Hannah, thank you, is in some of the literature about the Reformation sermons, that is reference to, well, it's just juxtaposed fashionable degeneracy versus a masculine brave spirit. It's there is a gendered interpretation of sort of the roots, the seeds of moral degeneracy. I'm sure this isn't novel, but it's just, I just wanted to flag that this rhetoric does appear in sermons preached before an audience in a port town like Hull, as much as it appeared in London. Something else I've been thinking about, Hannah, is really about the because the Rigby case is so notorious and had this public life. The experience in Hull seems to be all the time that the reformers couldn't embed their message, couldn't spread that message widely. And as I said, that meant the campaign shone brightly but briefly. The add-on to that is the legacy of the society in Hull, which was, I do have a quote here, which was taken from a sermon preached before the society in 1700. Jeremiah Gill, a dissenting minister, said, he addressed the reformers saying, "Thus may Hull have reason in generations yet unborn to bless God that such and such were once numbered amongst its inhabitants, your names living in the memories of survivors when your bodies are moulded in the dust, outliving the very monumental inscriptions on your tombs." Now, this was quite a hopeful message about, committing the campaign to posterity. But in everything I've looked at, it looks like all popular memory of this campaign had disappeared within a generation. There were subsequent waves of reforming activity, as we know, in Hull as elsewhere. In the 1720s, there appears to have been a religious society, and then, of course, 100 years later, you have you have Wilberforce's campaigns, and that had a local iteration in Hull, which probably had up to 2 or 3 times as many adherents, I think, as the first wave did. But when you look at the rhetoric that appears at the end of the 18th century and into the 19th century, there's absolutely no reference whatsoever or no received knowledge that there was formally another campaign that took place, took place on their streets at all. They've read their history, they know about the first wave of reformers, they've read Woodward, they've read Disney, but they make no reference to this first campaign. And I wonder if that was something to do with the dissenting complexion of the society as it was in 1698. The fact that those energies were sort of diffused in the ways I mentioned into the early 18th century, sort of the Hanoverian succession, all these things overtook in popular memory this campaign, which sort of had something of the flavour of the partisanship of Queen Anne's reign, and I think things moved on afterwards. But no, I was expecting to find some reference later on to the society, and I found none. Yeah.
And developing these ideas, I'd like to conclude this Rigby's sodomy trial that and its connections with the public memory, that it's notorious and in some way interesting. I think that over the centuries, Rigby became more celebrity than his persecutors. So now we are talking about Rigby's case, and it's possible to say the same about other sodomy trials taking place during the 18th century, that now we're talking more about molly houses or some certain victims of these persecutions than about their persecutors. Because William Minton is known only in this connection with the Captain Rigby's case, that because he acted as an agent of societies. And it's a kind of interesting focus because in this conversation with Minton, Rigby showed some signs of very early perception of public features and this celebrity culture, mentioning Peter and French king who were allegedly sodomites. But later, like months later, Rigby became celebrity himself, but celebrity with this dark shade, I think. So yes, these cases are very interesting from the point of view of perception and public memory.